So you shouldn't sort of lean back and relax and say, look at all these other tipping points that we still haven't tipped over. Uh, that should really make you even more worried or scared, because, that only means that these will collapse as well. So, yeah. Okay. So, the perhaps most important question that a lot of you will be having is like, why on earth should we follow like CI's numbers day to day or week to week or month to month? Well, it's a it's an important part of your future is decided by what sea ice in the Arctic decides to do. What does it want to do? Where does it want to go? That's more important than empty promises on Earth Day from different politicians around the world who say, we would like to do this and this, and we would like to go net zero by 2080 or whatever nonsense they are spewing. The thing is, we crossed the ice tipping point. I think while my grandparents were in their productive age, so it's like it's not even my generation's fault, and not even my parents' generation's fault. This is down to our grandparents, and when they made a choice, quote unquote, to do this, to trigger this runaway ice melt, they didn't even know. They had no idea what was going to happen. So yeah, cut them some slack if they're still here with us, because we as a humanity, we made this decision generations ago, and we didn't even know, most of us, what was happening and why it was wrong. So it's like it doesn't take away the blame from humanity, but it's like it's people who didn't know we were triggering this. So kind of on an individual level, we were without blame in a way. But anyway, so this is because we triggered this giant row of dominoes that are now falling. What it means is that Earth itself and the frozen parts of the Earth, the way glacier ice is melting, sea ice is melting, permafrost is melting or thawing. These parts of the Earth are now deciding the future, the climate future, the future of civilization, and the future basically of life on Earth. So it's not in the boardrooms of the NGOs or the boardrooms of the mega corporations or in the United Nations sessions for COP or whatever. They're not deciding this. Earth itself is deciding it by letting more and more dominoes fall after we triggered the fall of all the dominoes with pushing over the first domino 50 to 70 years ago. So, yeah, that's why we're following these numbers. That's why we're curious to see if this year is going to go to go to virtually no sea ice, and with all the repercussions and all the ramping up of abrupt global warming that will follow if this is the year that we lose all or most of all the sea ice. So till next time, take care, everyone, and try to find joy and some happiness in simple everyday life. And yeah, we'll see you already in 2 weeks now, because we're going to start following the sea ice volume every 3 weeks as well. So it's gonna be only 2 weeks to next time. Okay, bye. And then what's the Blue Ocean Event? That's a term that covers the late summer sea ice situation, and you then have, in volume terms, you have less than 1,000 cubic kilometers of sea ice left in the Arctic Ocean. And there are a lot of misunderstandings about what a Blue Ocean Event, or BOE, is all about. It's not an ice-free Arctic, obviously, because you still have loads of glaciers and major ice sheets, like the Greenland ice sheet. So it's not like the Arctic is free of ice. Even if you have a BOE, you only have a virtually ice-free seascape, or the Arctic Ocean is virtually free of ice, and then only for down to one single day. So it's not like, you hear people talk about an ice-free summer. This is September we're talking about, and maybe only one day in September, so it's not like the whole summer is ice-free, even if you have a BOE. So that's sort of the ice part of it. It's still a lot of ice left on land, and it's still a lot of ice left in the summer, even the summer you have a BOE. For most of the days, it's gonna be a lot of ice left in the ocean. And the other thing about the BOE is that when you have it, it will only be like a week or two before it starts refreezing. So it's not like it stays ice free for very long, even in the ocean. So right. So on top of that, it's a BOE is not the end of the world. It's not even the end of the civilization. And it's not a tipping point. A lot of people think it's a tipping point because everything that they think is scary, they say that's a tipping point. But technically, it's not a tipping point. It's just like your cup of coffee hitting the floor after it tipped a little bit before that. So if you have, like, say, a tipping point in the past century, causing the ice to disappear faster and faster, then the ice in the ocean hitting zero, or virtually zero, that's just a consequence of a prior tipping point, right? So, but it's kind of a milestone on the way down to a full societal collapse, of course, and it's a milestone for the climate situation. But that doesn't mean that all the animals and polar bears living in the Arctic Ocean die on the day you have a virtual ice free. It's more like an arbitrary technical limit of 1,000 cubic kilometers, or 1 million square kilometers of sea ice for the extent. But anyway, we are tracking whether or not this is going to be the summer that will end up with a Blue Ocean Event. So the biggest climate cope out there is this idea that climate change is something far away in the future, or variations thereof. And for this week's episode, I've looked at a new paper from Earth System Dynamics, published on 3rd June 2021, and I've only looked at the very first sentence from the abstract of this paper. It's a long paper, several pages, and I only got to the very first sentence of the sort of synopsis or abstract, and that's what I've presented on the left side of this graph, and it gets a lot of things wrong. It says that with progressing global warming, there is an increased risk that one or several tipping elements in the climate system might cross a critical threshold, resulting in severe consequences for the global climate ecosystems and human societies. So I guess a lot of reviewers and peers, that's to say other climate scientists, have looked at this since it was first submitted on in April 2020. That's like 14 months ago, 1 year and 2 months ago, and they're fine with it. They're totally fine with this sentence. So I don't know, maybe that's just because everybody has this difficulty of seeing what's wrong with it or what it actually tries to say. So I presented a different narrative using many of the same basic terms, and in my alternative presentation it says that with one or several tipping elements in the climate systems having now crossed a critical threshold, which is apparent from the resulting progressing global warming, there is an increased risk for severe consequences for the global climate ecosystems and human societies. So you're not just randomly having a progressing global warming. You have a progressing global warming because some of the feedback mechanisms that used to be in balance, not with the tipping point not crossed, have been put out of balance so that the tipping point is crossed and there is a point of no return for one or several tipping elements in the climate system. And that's why you're having a progressive global warming. It's not like global warming goes berserk and it gets warmer and warmer, faster and faster, and then all of a sudden you get a climate tipping point crossed. That's putting the cart before the horse. It's like I used to be a copy editor and even a first reader of books for a publishing house. Like mostly fictional climate novel type of books. And if somebody were to write a sentence in their story, in their fictional story, where the cart was before the horse, the cart was pulling the horse, and the horse sort of stumbled on down the streets after the cart, you'd sort of think that was a bit weird, and as a first reader, you have to point these things out if there are some kind of strange or illogical things going on in a text, even though the text is fictional. So you could, the way you could accept the cart dragging the horse is that the author was making a major point about it, that this was kind of a bizarro world, everything was upside down, blah blah blah. But if the author only writes this once, like all the other times he or she describes a horse and a cart. It's the horse first and the cart after, and you could also accept it if it was like, if it was an accident and they stumbled out of the road and fell down the slope, fell down the hill with the cart before the horse, and some kind of freak accident like that, right? So if you try to write that the cart was pulling the horse in a novel, you have to it has to be made a point of, because it's not what you expect, right? so odds would be that, okay, he's just made a kind of a mistake. It's like a typo. He typed this sentence too fast, and then the cart was dragging the horse in that sentence. So that's kind of something you just correct or suggest a correction. But then another case is if the novel is 500 pages, and even though the rest of the story is happening in a real kind of world that feels real in all other aspects. If repeatedly the cart is dragging the horse, if you have horse transport in that novel, you would suggest a hard no to the managers of that publishing business, right? Because this guy or this girl clearly has some kind of reality deficit in their author mind, and putting that kind of thing into a realistic story just makes it, not even wrong. It won't even be a published novel, right? So back to this scientific paper. They are actually suggesting that progressive global warming comes before the tipping elements, and not the other way around, which I have suggested on this other side. So I think if you're based in reality, there are tipping elements, tipping points that have been crossed. One is for Arctic sea ice, which this paper chose not to mention at all. Another tipping point that has been crossed is permafrost methane on land in Siberia, for instance, and also out at sea, which have tipped and then have been increasingly releasing methane and some digested methane as CO2 because of bacteria eating methane. So these tipping elements have been crossed already, and because of that, we have a very apparent progressing global warming, which is, progressing, going faster and faster, and putting us at a great risk for collapse of human society and further damage to the climate and ecosystems. So I'm just left wondering, is this a general opinion of a majority of climate scientists at Earth System Dynamics and their sort of scientist pool of writers, or maybe European and American climate scientists in general, that they actually believe more and more insane global warming comes first and sort of pushes the other things further down here, the tipping points, to be crossed somewhere in the future. It's always like 2100. These things could happen. The Arctic Ocean might be ice-free far in the future. Like, I think in 2007, the IPCC would say that you could have 1 or 2 summers with no sea ice at the end of summer in the 2080s or 2090s. That kind of craziness, and it's kind of slowly getting back to more realistic timeframes as the editions of their report are published. Maybe because otherwise they would just be laughed at even more than they are laughed at now. I don't know. So I just view this as a clear case of climate cope. It's like they understand that we have a problem, as they would say, but in order to still have a career and in order to still get published, they try to make this a problem to be fixed later, and to be fixed in part with insane fantasy technology that isn't even around, and they basically sound like they just want to leave it to new generations, younger generations, and sometimes they go as far as to encourage people to have more kids because one of those new 1 billion kids in the next decades might come up with a solution for climate change. As if we don't know what the solutions already are. It's just to, do less of what we do, basically. So I'm wondering if you have a 14-month review session with these guys, with these scientists, and they have a clear lack of logic in the very first sentence in their paper. Isn't that a case where you would just throw out the paper and say, okay, sorry guys, you messed up. We won't bother to read the rest of your paper because already the very first sentence is like, totally lacking in understanding of the system. I don't know. Or maybe it's the other way around, that these scientists actually wrote a very good and thorough paper on the chain of events between these tipping points, and then the editing board and the peer review process forced them to to put this silly sentence into their abstract, and also forced them to not include methane or RTCIs at all in their paper. I don't know. I wasn't a fly on the wall there, so maybe they spent those 14 months making the paper worse, making it less realistic, and just leaving it with the AMOC and the West Antarctic and Greenland and the Amazon as the only tipping elements in the climate system. So I know Paul Beckwith has criticized them for those things that they left out there. But, in my case, maybe it looks like a shallow analysis, but I kind of think of it as going even deeper, even though I'm just reviewing the very first sentence of the abstract. But, this is what I call climate cope. It's related to lying, but it's like a collective coping mechanism. You consciously or unconsciously deny a lot of things, a lot of obvious things, like obvious things like this is already gone too far, and then we can take it from there. But if you look at it with an open mind, it's everything that follows will have to be equally ridden with lies and logical errors. Like, let's just pretend that Greenland starts melting massively in a vacuum, like they do in the paper, and not include the fact that when Greenland's coasts are getting increasingly ice-free, that also heats up the Greenland ice sheet, inside on land in Greenland, and stuff like that. Maybe you have to actually live here in Greenland like I do in order to see how that is ludicrous, but I would guess that 14 months of review process before this paper is even published should do away with that kind of silly, stupid kindergarten mistakes, but that's just me, perhaps. Okay. Take care, don't get the COVID, and bye. So, I may have come out pretty fortunate the last time when I chose to go in at the deep end and criticize a fresh climate report from June in one specific report by only looking at the first sentence of the abstract. And in that first sentence, it was very clear that the authors put what you call the cart before the horse, so that they were saying that if we warm so and so much, then we may trigger feedback mechanisms that will warm the temperature, right? So that's like saying, for a musical or an audio person, it's like saying, if I sing loud enough, I may trigger the speaker feedback thing, making the sound go louder and louder. But it's the other way around. If you trigger the feedback, the sound gets louder and louder, right? So later in June, you had the release of the entire UN climate report leak, or we didn't get the 4,000-page report itself, but we got a press or a journalistic write-up about the report from AFP, the French news service. And the fortunate thing about this cart before the horse thing, to sort of criticize a climate report on the really, really deep stuff, is that the UN climate report that only comes out in late February 2022. But we don't have to read to wait for the reporter to read the report, because already from the leak and the reporting on the leak, we know that they're doing the exact same thing. They are attributing the warming that we see already to some future tipping points, to some future points of no return, that when broken or when tipped will make it warmer, like we're seeing today. So it's like they are kind of saying that today it's warming for no reason, and if we go over the tipping point for the methane, the permafrost, and the ice caps and the sea ice, then only then will it get warmer, right? So what they're really hiding is the fact that we already crossed those tipping points, and doubtless many more. For instance, the ocean and the Amazon, they have also started to emit carbon instead of soaking it up. So in case after case, these tipping points, points of no return, things we shouldn't cross, they have been crossed, but they still keep talking about them like they are something we could avoid. They haven't already happened. They are in the future. Yeah. And why doesn't it make sense? Why won't this thing go? It's because you misunderstood something very, very basic. So this is the normal way that people used to travel with horse and carry. You have the horse here, and you sit on wheels behind here, and the horse sort of drags you through the street or through the city and to the next city. So how could they make this get this so wrong? I got actually really good help from Reddit. There was a comment on Reddit for my last video, and someone there suggested that, okay, so you're unfamiliar with having the cart before the horse, but it's not unthinkable. Let's see here. So if you have this as the regular setup, and we're talking about, going over the cliff and going into collapse, then you have this one sort of tipping over the edge of the cliff, and then you have another variation is this one where everything is upside down. And if you see a horse and carry falling like this, like with the cart down, or leading the fall, the cart down and the horse up here, then obviously it's in a free fall situation, so it's over the cliff, it's in collapse. And the suggestion from this guy on Reddit was that the fact that the not only the one single climate report, but also the collective United Nations climate panel report still make these so-called mistakes, still make these cart before the horse things. The reason I do that is actually indicative that we are over the cliff. It's sort of their part semi-hidden way of admitting that we are in collapse. We're over the cliff, we're in free fall, and even our logic as humans and as United Nations and as a climate panel is now a collapsed logic. We can't tell it like it is. We have to lie about these tipping points and these points of no return. And the fact that you can actually read black on white in these reports a warped up logic like this is your best sign that it is already way too late. This is over the edge, we are over the edge, this thing is going south. So in today's Climate Cope rant, we'll look at Professor Hans-Joachim Schellnhuber, who founded the Potsdam Institute for Climate Science in 1992, and according to himself, he coined the term tipping point for use in climate science in 2003, and in the context that we know as climate tipping points. So let's say that Schellnhuber takes his family to West Norway, to the Preacher's Chair, the famous cliff in the west. And he brings, along with his family, he also brings his cat that we can see here. It's slightly larger than the rest of the people, and we can see also Hans Joachim over here, the edge, watching over all of this. So let's say they have a beautiful summer holiday in the sun, and they have some barbecue, and as these things happen, a little sausage falls over the edge, and the cat over here, Schellnhuber's cat, he or she, let's call it he, very much wants that sausage. He wants to eat it, so he jumps after it. And so, in the context of tipping points, this cat is kind of over the edge. You know, it's like he wants that sausage, and he don't know where the sausage is, but the cat is kind of, you know, going in this fashion down through midair. And the question for Schellnhuber then is like, is Schellnhuber's cat dead or alive in this time before it hits the ground? So in Schellnhuber's own view, he's not really sure if the cat is over the edge. He doesn't really know if a tipping point, you know, has been crossed here. Are we over the tipping point? Or is that to be determined later? For instance, when a crew finds the cat, you know, further down below the cliff. And maybe a more realist view is that, okay, whatever made the cat jump after the sausage, it's over the cliff. The tipping point was passed, and then it's like the difficult consequences will follow because it's over the edge, basically, right? So you see where I'm going here. The cat fell off the cliff, and it will most certainly die. So why am I making this analogy? Well, according to Schellnhuber, praising the Paris conference in 2015, the targets for 2°C warming are adequate, and as a consequence we have a carbon budget that we can still burn in the Western world and the Eastern world and the Southern world, the mid-earth, whatever. We have a carbon budget because we don't know if the tipping points are crossed or not. So we want to avoid crossing the tipping points because they most certainly lead to a cascade of triggering other tipping points. But Schellnhuber either doesn't know or won't say that we crossed a number of tipping points already, like let's say methane, Arctic sea ice, the Greenland mountain ice, and the West Antarctic glacier mountain ice. So if these tipping points are already crossed, then we don't have a carbon budget. But that's not a pleasant thing to think about, because then we would have to immediately stop emitting carbon, because we don't have a budget. So it's not safe or wise or responsible to burn any more carbon. Or it's like Schellnhuber says, that we do have a carbon budget because we couldn't be bothered to check whether or not our tipping points for the climate are already crossed, right? So, what is it, Chalnober? Is your cat dead or alive in midair? Did it fall over the cliff? And did the melting ice fall over a cliff? Are you telling us that's not an important question, or, what is it? So we are very, very far from being in danger of a blue ocean event. It's kind of interesting that you have a sort of a cliffhanger for the very, very last day, which is yesterday. You have this 130,000 square kilometer melt for Wednesday, and it's red level, so it's maybe, turning over into a slightly higher rate of melt, higher than average even. And we've also seen that in the Central Arctic Basin sea ice area stats for the latest days. So we may have sort of gone over a cliff, but on, only the regular cliff that you have every late summer, right? So it's not the civilization ending cliff. It's more like the modern decades ice melt cliff, which occurs every year. So about that, because it looks very, very unlikely that we're going to have a blue ocean event in 2021. But having said that, it's kind of a done deal that we will see a blue ocean event in one of the next years. It's like, how could we not? But just as 2021 appears to be an outlier with slower melt and less melt, maybe not as warm in the Arctic as other recent years, we suspect also that the year that we finally go over the edge to the blue ocean event will also be an outlier, but just a negative outlier with less ice, of course. So these variations, these natural variations with some higher years and some lower years, that's what you're gonna have to expect when it comes to natural phenomena, and also when it comes to the Arctic. So, because we passed the tipping point for the sea ice many decades ago, at least in my opinion, or from looking at data for the sea ice, it's pretty clear that it isn't collapsing for no reason. So when it goes over the tipping point, it doesn't really move very fast immediately. It's like it goes over, and then it just gradually disappears faster and faster. So when you finally hit the ground after going over the cliff, and you hit the ground, in this case, when you have no sea ice left at the end of the season, that's not because that's a tipping point. That's because the tipping point was before, and now you finally see the consequences of the tipping point, which is like hitting the ground hard. Okay. So in this week's Climate Cope rant, we'll look at the different copes people have when you tell them that we have passed the tipping point. And the first of these copes is there's not just one tipping point, but many tipping points. And that's like saying, okay, never mind, we passed the first 4 or 5 tipping points like here. There are many coming later, and that's supposed to be some kind of comfort that these are going to crash later. These tipping points are line up like dominoes in a cascade, and tipping 1 or 4 or 5 dominoes first will also secure the later tipping of the others. But still these people cling to the hope that, oh, there are still some tipping points that haven't been crossed, that are much, much bigger, like the East Antarctic and stuff. So, okay, well, whatever gets you through the night. And the second coping mechanism is to say that no, we didn't pass the tipping point. The ice is just flowing like crazy for no reason. And that's like, okay, tells me more about your inner life and your feelings in a way than what's actually happening on the ground. And a third way of reacting or coping to the tipping point message is to say that we cross some tipping points, but they're not irreversible. So it's like they have a private definition of a tipping point, a definition that doesn't include the word irreversible, which, as it happens, is a key part of the definition of a climate tipping point. It is that it's gone too far, it's beyond the point of no return, and it's not reversible. So, and the fourth cope is to say that we didn't cross any tipping points because my feelings, and it's a variation of the others, you see it most often in the shape of, no, we didn't pass the tipping point because that would mean you have to say we are effed, or we should just do nothing, or we should just give up. So they have this sort of complete narrative that they have from, I guess, TV or social media, or from reading Michael Mann's book or something. And it prohibits them from actually realizing that you pass the tipping point, because they believe that if you say A, we have passed the tipping point, then you have to say B, C, D, E, F, G, A, L, blah, blah, the rest of the alphabet, as some kind of, it has to be this way. No, it doesn't. And in my opinion anyway, you should be able to, neutrally judge whether or not we have passed the ice tipping point and the Arctic tipping point and the CO2 tipping point and the ocean giving out CO2 instead of soaking it up tipping point, and the Amazon and the soil starting to release CO2. These are things that are objective properties of our planet, and you shouldn't have to link that to different kinds of social reactions to the fact. You should be able to, put on your scientific hat and say, we either did pass these tipping points already or we didn't. And then, deal with the consequences later. The science doesn't, react to whether or not you feel good about it. But that's my opinion anyway. So apparently the research team that went to the North Pole and the Arctic Ocean in a ship that was intentionally frozen and drifting with the ice for over a year. They've returned half a year ago to Germany, and they've studied the long afterwork of analyzing all the data. And they've had a press conference this summer where their research director stated that we may have already crossed the tipping point for the Arctic, and as a consequence, global warming may be irreversible at this point. So that's, kind of a late statement, or it is not the first statement of this kind, but it's like you can't really claim that somebody who has had a huge team of many hundred scientists, Arctic and climate scientists, being on a ship and on the ice for 12 months. It's the biggest polar expedition ever in history. You can't really claim that their science director and their research director doesn't know what he's talking about. Clearly he knows a thing or two about the Arctic, and the way he frames it at the press conference is that, yes, we most likely triggered this climate tipping point, and because it's the big and early and important tipping point, it means that the global warming saga is now irreversible. It doesn't mean it's not possible to do anything. It means basically that the Arctic doesn't need any more input from industry, from human society. It doesn't require high emissions of CO2 anymore in order to keep melting and keep heating up further. That's sort of the definition, in layman's terms. Of course, you could imagine things that we could do in order to preserve the ice, human ingenuity, human ability to come up with ideas. It's kind of endless, but in many cases, the suggestions, when analyzed further, will actually make one or two or three things even worse than they are now. And just because you have an idea doesn't mean it's a super idea, okay? But yeah, so it's important, I think, that the first domino, or the first tipping point, is framed by this research team in the way that global warming as a whole is now irreversible, because we have, like I've illustrated here, we have set off the first of these kind of tiny dominoes, but because of the way dominoes work, or because of the way a cascade of tipping points and points of no return work, they will create huge, massive effects, further down the line. And it's really no comfort that there are massive ice masses in East Antarctica that still haven't tipped, because the setup is that the Arctic, the sea ice in the Arctic, and the Greenland melt, and the heating of the ocean because of albedo changes, all of these things will eventually transport themselves down to the Antarctica, and the West Antarctic ice sheet has already tipped, and you will see the same thing going even to East Antarctica, and you will start losing ice like crazy in the entire South Pole area as a consequence of tipping these first initial tipping points and setting off these dominoes. So you shouldn't sort of lean back and relax and say, look at all these other tipping points that we still haven't tipped over. That should really make you even more worried or scared, because, that only means that these will collapse as well. So, yeah. Okay.
Because the ice must flow.